as a writer, I learn by writing my books. I learn by researching my books. So therefore, my ideas over time will change. I'm unusual as a writer, probably, in that I have no bees in my bonnet. I'm not writing because I want to prove anything. I'm not coming from a religious point of view. I'm not coming from a materialist reductionist point of view. I'm coming from literally an objective. What does the information tell me? So every book has helped me develop the ideas and hone them and polish them. And effectively, Cheating the Ferryman, put simply, is, I think, a fairly revolutionary model of what happens when we die.
My guest today is Anthony Peake. He is a best-selling author, lecturer, broadcaster, and leading thinker in the area of consciousness studies. His ideas apply scientific reasoning to some of the greatest mysteries of the universe, including what happens when we die. He's a member of the Society For Psychical Research, and his work has been peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. He's written 12 books, with his 13th coming out later this year. It was a real pleasure for me to sit down and learn about Anthony's ideas and dig into those, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my interview with Anthony Peake. Ben, there was actually a quote that I found from your book, Labyrinth of Time, that I think really seems like a great starting point for our discussion. You basically state that it's difficult to reconcile oneself to the view that a single life determines our lot. We seem to have come to the end of our life just when we begin to get some insight. And I was hoping that you could elaborate on that a bit and how that has kind of guided your perspective on your research.
Absolutely, that's an excellent start to an interview. Nobody's actually put that quotation back to me, and I think that's a profound point because it's very much central to my work. And the argument I've always used is that everybody, when we experience life, there's the idea you learn by your mistakes. Now, if we only have one singular life, we get to my age. I mean, I'm 70 now. You get to my age, and you look back over your life. And you see all the mistakes you made, and you see all of the opportunities you missed, the people you hurt, and everything else as well. And you're in the position where you go, do you know what? I've learned so much from that. And here I am in the twilight of my years with nowhere to then apply and use that information and use those experiences in a positive way. Now, as I said in one of my books, it seems incredible waste of time that the universe has existed for, 13.7 billion years. And in that period of time, something that was you was a spark of something that was experiencing something that existed for an infinitely tiny amount of time and then disappeared again for the rest of the period of the universe. Now, to me, that, I know it's been very anthropomorphic, but effectively that seems such an incredible waste of everything. And if every single sentient being in the universe is mortal, intelligence will never evolve because we can never really go anywhere. We can never as an individual, we can only go forward as a species. Now, unless you take the Jungian idea of the collective unconscious, which we can come on to in a second, because it's an interesting point, this, because I'm actually writing an article at the moment about this very subject. So either we can go forward and say, we carry through genetically. In other words, we are literally tools of our genetic code. So in which case, all we are effectively are vehicles for genes. But that doesn't mean that sentience carries through. Unless you argue that at another level, there is another level of consciousness that is effectively the consciousness of all sentient beings. And this is very much my argument, and it was very much the justification for my Cheating the Ferryman point of view.
Would you go into detail on the Cheating the Ferryman? I think there's people who may not be aware of what that is.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's in all my 13 books. It's been the general theme all the way through. Now, all my books are iterative in that I argue that as a writer, I learn by writing my books. I learn by researching my books. So therefore, my ideas over time will change. I'm unusual as a writer, probably, in that I have no bees in my bonnet. I'm not writing because I want to prove anything. I'm not coming from a religious point of view. I'm not coming from a materialist reductionist point of view. I'm coming from literally an objective, what does the information tell me? So every book has helped me develop the ideas and hone them and polish them. And effectively, Cheating the Ferryman, put simply, is, I think, a fairly revolutionary model of what happens when we die. And over the years, I've been very interested in near-death experiences. In fact, my latest book is on near-death experiences. And I've also been interested in the human condition, as to what exactly we are and why we are here. And Cheating the Ferryman, to me, gives me a very satisfactory, for me anyway, scientifically based model for human immortality that does not contradict science in any way at all. You know, effectively, when you say if you die and you go somewhere else, the question is, how does your consciousness leave your brain? How is your consciousness processed if you are no longer in your brain? And although there is counter-argument to say there's lots of evidence that people can perceive things outside of the body, scientifically, that means that we have to throw away our scientific model completely. Our scientific understanding of how nature works is completely destroyed by the idea that sentience can occur outside of a brain. So for me, I needed to find a model that would make sense scientifically, that I could take to the scientific community and say, there is proof of life after death, and it doesn't contradict anything you're saying. And effectively what I argue is that at the point of death, and you referenced my book, The Labyrinth of Time, which I think was quite important, and I think that was one of my most important books, but it's sold the least of all my books, which I find quite extraordinary. Well, it's not actually, there's one or two others that have sold less, but of my major books, that's the poorest seller. But what I suggest is that one thing we do is we die in time. In other words, no other writer I'm aware of has actually jumped to the conclusion to say that, well, I die, but maybe from my point of view, I don't. And this is very much applying an idea that was put forward in the late 1990s by a quantum physicist a cosmologist called Max Tegmark. And Tegmark is a Swiss academic was based, I still probably think still is at Princeton University. And he's a mathematical physicist. And he applied something called Schrodinger's cat in physics to suggest that we're all potentially immortal. And in rough terms, he argues that your universe can only continue to exist if you continue to exist as an observer. In other words, all we're doing now is we are collapsing the wave function of a particular reality. And again, it gets very, very technical. And in my books, I go into great detail about the technical aspects of this in layman's terms, in layperson's terms. But effectively, Tegmark argues that you can prove that each of us is technically immortal. Now, I apply that to practical issues, and I apply specifically the evidence from near-death experiences. Now, near-death experiences are categorized by something called the Moody traits. Now, these are a series of known effects that people report when they have near-death experiences. They report that they have an out-of-body experience. They report that they see going towards a white light. But there were two of the issues that really intrigued me when I started researching this, because the two that are particularly important is the time dilation effects. People turn around and say when they're in a near-death experience state, time seems to expand. They're in a timeless zone. From their point of view, 1 second could be an hour, a week, a year, or a lifetime. Now, again, in my books, I do the neurology of this. I do how neurologically this may happen. I also do the mathematics of how it may happen. I apply something called Thomson's lamp to this. And the idea is that we all live in subjective perceptions of time. And I'll guarantee that you and a lot of your watchers, your people that watch your videos will know this, that sometimes you're in a car crash and suddenly time seems to slow down. You seem to have time to maneuver your way around the accident. Also, if you're given bad news, suddenly time dilates. It also does it in dreams. You know, you can wake up in the morning, the alarm goes off, you put it on snooze, you have a whole dream, and then you come back and you've been away for hours having a huge dream. Now, I argue this is what happens when you die. You enter this other time zone, this other subjective time, because of course time is the one thing we have that we only measure by itself. We can only ever have a minute of a minute or an hour of an hour. So I could never know that your perception of a minute is the same as mine, because there's no objective measurement that we can both measure against to say that, oh, well, that was just a minute. And that's a profoundly important concept, because I believe that what happens at the point of death is neurotransmitters are released in the brain, or neurochemicals are released in the brain that bring about the slowing down of time. So hold that one for a second. Then take the other argument of the other thing that lots of people report in near-death experiences is the panoramic life review. This is when people turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes. Now, I argue that in a near-death experience, your life flashes before your eyes. But in a real death experience, what I call an RDE, it doesn't flash in front of your eyes. You literally drop out of time and you literally go into a simulation of your life, rather like a third-person computer, VR, fully immersive version of your life that's digitally rendered. And I argue that within the greater universe, everything is information. This is what Tegmark argues as well. Everything is basically information. We're running on a vast, for want of a better term, a vast holographic computer program. And within that program, the outcome of every decision that can possibly be made by anybody or any sentient being is already programmed in there. So taking that into account, it means that there will be a rendered reality within the many worlds interpretation within the multiverse that will contain the outcome of every decision you can make in your life. So when you die, what actually happens is during the dying process, you flick into one of these alternate universes and you're catapulted back to the day of your birth and you start your life again. And when you start your life again, it's like when you restart a computer game. You know, you're playing a computer game and you have your on-screen sprite, and the on-screen sprite runs into a room, gets eaten by a monster. That on-screen sprite is then dead. But the game player, the person playing the game, is allowed to reel back and start the game again. Now, what I argue is that within the simulation, what I call the Bonian IMAX, there is a version of you that's in the game, which I call the Eidolon, which only lives one life. Then there's a version of you that plays all the games of your life, your game player. And the game player I call your daemon. And the game player, literally every life that you live and then you die, the daemon remembers. And it can then try to communicate with you to navigate you around the problems of this life now. Now, as time has progressed, I first came up with this idea about 1997, something like that. Since then, our knowledge of computer programming, our knowledge of data processing, our knowledge of virtual reality, and how we can create virtual reality worlds, it now can be shown, it can be proven that imagine that you were, for instance, placed inside a haptic feedback suit of your body. And as you move in this reality, you're in a virtual reality that mimics your movements. And then you had all past lives of your past life memory wiped out. How would you know that you weren't in a simulation? And the argument is you can't. It's impossible. But there is a slight glitch in the matrix, which 70% of people experience. And I think this is the biggest proof of my hypothesis. Déjà vu. 70% of people worldwide will have at least one déjà vu experience in their life. And déjà vu, as you all know, is that sudden recognition of a set of circumstances you find yourself in that you recognize from an indeterminate part of your past that you've experienced it before. That kind of recognition. Now, technically, what you're experiencing there is not déjà vu, which is already seen, but déjà vécu, which is already lived. So there's a lot of different déjà experiences, but déjà vécu is the most important one. Now, I argue that this is a kind of a bleed through from your higher self, your daemonic consciousness, that you're remembering you've done it before, that you have this recognition. Now, I know of people that have contacted me that have precognitive déjà vus or déjà vécus, where they know what's going to happen next. And that's not uncommon. Now, if it is simply a neurological glitch, as people like Robert Efron have argued in the past, That doesn't explain precognitive déjà vus. It doesn't explain how you know what's going to happen next if it's literally just a delay in signals within the brain. So to me, déjà vu is exactly, or déjà vécu is exactly what it feels. You've lived this before. Now, going back to your excellent initial question, this is the solution to us just living one life and dying. Because there's a version of you, as I say, I call the daemon, which carries forward all the memories of your past lives, because at the end of that second life, you live again and again and again. In fact, the Russian language edition of my book, my first book, was called Groundhog Life. So it's like Groundhog Day. And Groundhog Day is a very powerful analogue to my hypothesis, because that's what Connors does in the movie, doesn't he? He lives the same day over and over again, but effectively he's like what I call a dyad. It's his daemon and his eidolon working together, because his eidolon, which is in the game, remembers what he did the day before and acts upon that information. That's what the daemon does. It acts upon the information it got from the previous lives to modify how way you approach this life. And of course, if you remember, Connors initially lives the same day over and over again and tries to do all the selfish things. He wants to bed the girl, and he does all these things that are negative. Then he tries to commit suicide dozens of occasions. I've actually interviewed Danny Rubin, the guy that wrote the book, and this is an interesting aside. Rubin told me that he's an academic at Harvard. When he came across my first book, he gave copies for Christmas to all his friends at Harvard, said this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. But suffice to say, you live the same day over and over, and he lives the same day over and over again. But then he starts to do good for doing good's sake. He starts to be running around the town trying to save people's lives, saving the kid falling out of the tree, trying to save the tramp, this kind of thing. And this is what I think we do over many, many lives. We then live the perfect life. We play the perfect game. And what happens when you end playing the perfect game, when you're playing, say, Tomb Raider? You start another game. You've now done all the iterations of that game and you start a new one. Now, I know people will turn around and say, oh, utter nonsense, how can you even prove this? I can. I do prove it in my books. You know, I very much take the argument that extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And this is exactly what I do. If you read my books, you will know that every single thing I write about is referenced directly back to academic papers. And I request my readers to go back to the academic papers and read the academic paper. And if what I'm saying doesn't make sense to them, that's great. Come back to me, because I very actively react with my readers. And if somebody points out that, you know, you've got this wrong or you've misinterpreted, that's great. I will change my point of view and everything. But so far, that's never happened. So far, nobody's come back to me and say that your interpretation is wrong. All they've said is that maybe the way you've pulled the information together might be a little bit optimistic. But there is nothing I know that contradicts scientifically the things I'm saying. Nothing. And indeed, for instance, in my new book, which comes out in November, the foreword is written by one of the top up-and-coming neuroscientists in the world, a guy called Dr. Pascal Michael. You know, and this guy's working with DMT, he's working with lots of top researchers worldwide. And he asked me, could he write the foreword to my new book? So that's the seriousness that my ideas are being taken by academia. And this is why you don't see me on television, you don't see me, you know, being a person that everybody knows about, because my work is avoided. My work compromises a lot of the top scientists who don't like it because they can't argue with it. And the philosophy has always been with me, just ignore him. He'll go away. They never ever engage with me because they can't. And if they can, all they know is I'll just take what they're saying and incorporate it into the hypothesis. So this is why I'm probably not as famous as well, it's not as famous as I should be. I don't care how famous I am. It's immaterial to me. I don't care. It's the ideas. But my work, but I'll guarantee that in a few years' time, my work will be important and other people will take my work forward. Now, just as a final point as well, I also do the science of how the daemon communicates with us, why it is that certain people are guided much more closely by their daemon than other people. And I wrote a book a few years ago called Opening the Doors of Perception. And in this, I discuss exactly how certain people's doors of perception, their communication with their daemon, is greater than other individuals. And again, it's neurologically sound, you know?
Right. That's, for me personally, when I first became aware of you, that was what was most compelling, was the fact that it was very clear that all of these very disparate things I'd been learning about through science and religion, they all seemed to come together in a way that was cohesive with the story that you were telling or the theory that you were presenting. And that's where I was like, really had to kind of step back and think about digging into that further. And that's why I'm so pleased to have you here. And it's funny, you've actually answered 3 of my questions already. So
sorry.
One step ahead of me. No. So you just mentioned communication with the daemon. Certain people have a more connection there. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how would one go about increasing that communication, and is there any detriment to that, or is it, because I'm aware of, for example, certain schizophrenia and things like that, it becomes difficult to function in this reality with that a level of perception. So what is the balance there? How can one improve that without going off the deep end in a way?
Okay, this is again maybe a book I've thought about writing in the future. Whether I will do it or I'll leave it to other people, I don't know yet. But in terms of communicating with the daemon, there are various techniques that can be used. But what I need to do is do a step back here and explain what I call my Huxleyan spectrum. And the Huxleyan spectrum, as placed in the book Opening the Doors of Perception, is the idea like a continuum from neurotypicals, that's individuals that don't communicate with their daemon at all and probably don't have any odd, strange experiences, don't have out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, these kind of things. Now, these individuals, their doors of perception are closed. But as you start to move along the spectrum, depending upon the neurological correlates of how your brain functions, will depend on whether a demonic consciousness can come in. Now, initially, in my initial model, and I'm still not sure whether this will continue to be valid, I argue that from evidence from split brain operations, way back from the 1940s to the 1960s, there were a series of operations done with people who had intractable epilepsy. And in order to stop somebody becoming unconscious, what surgeons would do is they cut the corpus callosum, which is the nerve body that holds the two sides of the brain together, the two hemispheres of the brain. And they found by cutting it that what would happen is that the electrical storm in the brain wouldn't cross over to the other hemispheres, they wouldn't become unconscious, which meant that the operations cured people of losing consciousness. But what the guys doing the work, people like Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, discovered was that you ended up with 2 personalities, 2 completely different people. And this was consistent. And this was a shock because they didn't expect this. They thought that we were kind of unitary, but they discovered that there are all the time 2 personalities in the brain. The one in the dominant hemisphere and the non-dominant hemisphere. And in most states, when they cut the corpus callosum, they found some extraordinary things. Like ordinarily, the non-dominant hemisphere is not verbal. It cannot speak, because the language areas of the brain are normally in the dominant hemisphere, normally with most of us in the left hemisphere. But what it can do, the non-dominant hemisphere, it works the other side of the body. So they had one young man, this is extraordinary, young man called P.S., and they were asking him what he wanted to be when he grew up, when he became an adult, and he said he wanted to be a quantity surveyor, something very normal and everything else. Meanwhile, there were a group of Scrabble cards on the table, and his left hand, being worked by his non-dominant hemisphere, picked up Scrabble cards and wrote out automobile racer. And as Sperry and Gazzaniga said, this was a realization that there's a part of us that's been overridden all the time with its ambitions. It wants to be an automobile racer, whereas the other side wants to be something else. Now, this explains things like alien hand syndrome, Whereas people, or a lady will be deciding to go to work and she's had a split brain operation or she's had a stroke or something, which means that the two sides of the brain aren't communicating as well, which means that the non-dominant hemisphere has more say in things. And many cases, the person will go to wear certain clothes and one hand will go out to pick a certain dress and the other hand will wrestle and pull the hand down and grab another dress. Now, this to me was evidence that these two personalities, is this the daemon and the eidolon? Now, it's not quite as simplistic as that, but neurologically I believe that there is feedback between the two. Now, that means that some individuals, when they have certain neurological correlates, like myself, I suffer from classic migraine. So I have an aura state before I have a migraine attack. In fact, I only get the aura state now. So I'll see jagged patterns in front of my eyes and I'll get tingling in my fingers and things, and I know I'm going to have a migraine attack. Now, that is the first level where the daemon can communicate. During the aura state of a migraine attack, the daemon can message you, can give you symbols, can communicate. Now, I also have very powerful hypnagogic imagery, which is that kind of imagery you get just before you go to sleep at night, when you're in that liminal state where you see faces in profile or you hear voices whispering. And the same happens when you wake up in the morning, and that's called hypnopompia. And both of these liminal states are where the daemon can come through. And this is where I believe precognitive dreaming takes place, where people have dreams and they come true a couple of days later. And this is because the daemon can message you using your dreams. And we know precognitive dreaming is very real. I have so much evidence of it. And the question is, how can we dream the future? Well, of course, Cheating the Ferryman suggests, well, you're actually dreaming your past. You've already experienced these events and your dream is remembering something from the past, as is a déjà vu sensation. So the doors of perception are slightly open. Then you move on. I call it the Huxleyan spectrum, by the way, in deference to Aldous Huxley, whose 1954 book, The Doors of Perception, was what influenced me and has influenced a lot of people, including the band The Doors, who call their name after The Doors of Perception. So you move on, and neurologically, I've spoken to psychologists, I've spoken to neuroscientists and neurologists, and I am right about this, that when you get to extreme levels of migraine, you move into an overlap area, which is like temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, in temporal lobe epilepsy, the doors of perception are open more, which means the daemon can communicate verbally sometimes. Not only that, the daemon can sometimes manifest in your visual front of you. This is the doppelganger effect that people talk about. Now, I have associates of mine, because over the years I've been contacted now by literally hundreds of temporal lobe epileptic, or people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy from around the world. They all contact me because they say, my God, you are the first writer that's actually writing about what I experience. My God, you've got it head on. And their daemon, I mean, for instance, is one of my associates now, Myron Dial, who's a Californian artist. His daemon has been manifesting in his life since he was 4 years of age. His daemon is called Charon. And in fact, when I did Contact in the Desert in California last year, Myron attended and Myron was in the audience. And when I did my talk on the daemon, Myron was there to back up experientially my hypothesis and my theory. Now, so then you get to there, and then when you go through temporal lobe epilepsy, you get to the far end of temporal lobe epilepsy where Myron is, and it starts to overlap into schizophrenia, where the doors are now wide open. So suddenly the information field, the information knowledge that's available to the daemon suddenly is leaking through massively, which means that the person almost cannot function because they are tuning into so much information. They're hearing voices, they're telepathic, they are seeing the future, they're seeing the past. One of the main things of schizophrenia is schizophrenics don't live in the present moment. They flick into the past, they flick into the future, and they become completely confused. And they act irrationally because it's information overload. And this is because the doors are blasted open. And then from there I link two or three other things, like savant syndrome, I think is linked to this as well. People who, their abilities to engage with information in their brain is far greater than a neurotypical. I mean, and again, if you are interested, this will astonish you. If you go onto my own YouTube site, Anthony Peake on YouTube, I do interviews like this, and I interviewed a young lady called Rebecca Sharrock, who is another person who is involved with another area of my spectrum, which is called autism. She's very autistic, very bright, and she is one of only 8 living people who have what's called HSAM, which is highly superior autobiographical memory. She remembers every single thing that's ever happened in her life. She even remembers her dreams. She even remembers being in the womb. Okay? Now, I interviewed her live, and it's a live recording, and halfway through the interview, I decided to check just how powerful her memory was. Okay? Now, my assistant that does the show, Sarah, her daughter is a great fan of Harry Potter, and Sarah and her daughter have all the Harry Potter books. Now, I knew that Rebecca also loves the Harry Potter books, so I didn't tell her I was going to do this, but halfway through the interview, I said, Rebecca, I'm going to test you now. And I said, Sarah, can you pick at random one of your Harry Potter books? And she did. And I said, can you open it at a random page and start reading a random paragraph? And I said, okay, Rebecca, when she starts reading it, I want you to see how far you get and see if you can finish what she's reading. She got 4 or 5 words in, and Rebecca read the whole paragraph from her mind. Now that is extraordinary. That is the power of the daemon. Because what I argue is that we record every single experience we have. Now, everything, your brain is recording everything, and it's storing it holographically. I've always argued, why does the brain do that? Because we can't access it. And of course we do it because every life you do, your brain is downloading that information into an information field so it can be replayed, so it can be reused. And you do that every life. So every life you live, you record it and you draw it up from this huge information field, which I call the Akashic field, using the work of a guy called Irving Laszlo, who I've written a book with. And the argument is that this whole field of information can be accessed depending on how wide your doors of perception are open. Now, this explains savant syndrome, people like Kim Peake and people like that, you know, the guy that Rain Man was based upon. I've worked with these guys. They are extraordinary. The things they can, it's just extraordinary how they know these things. And nobody knows how they can do it. I do. They're just accessing the information field below them. And again, I interviewed Daryl Trefford, who was the consultant who worked with Kim Peake, the Rain Man guy. And some of the things he told me was just extraordinary about Kim Peake. And here we go again. You know, everything I write in my books, it's just tick, 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 tick. There are no negatives. Experientially, it's proven. I also argue that Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is also opening the doors of perception. And again, I do the neurology of this because my mother died of Alzheimer's disease and I witnessed a lot of these things. With Alzheimer's disease, what happens is, you know, within your brain, you have neurons. And within each neuron, there are literally millions, if not billions, of tiny structures of tubulin, which are called microtubules. Now, Professor Stuart Hamerhoff and Professor Roger Penrose, one's an anesthesiologist, the other one is a mathematician, have come together with a model they call orchestrated objective reduction, which argues that the brain works using quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And these little structures draw up the information from the information field, which then projects outwards to create this three-dimensional reality we think is real. So we are projecting this outwards, so the simulation we're living in is effectively projected out from us to fill our visual field. Now, so trillions and trillions of these microtubules in your brain are drawing up the information to create this reality. But they also act as attenuators. They also act to block out what the information you don't need to survive within this game. Because if you are hearing everything and dealing with everything, as autistic people do and schizophrenics do, you can't function. So what the brain does is it cuts this stuff out. This is the work of Aldous Huxley, this is the work of C.D. Broad, and it's the work of a guy called Henri Bergson. All these guys over the years have argued this. Now, again, as far as I'm aware, and I stand corrected here, but I think I'm the only person in the world that spotted this. When people get Alzheimer's, inside the brain are things called amyloid plaques. And what the amyloid plaques do is they float through the brain and they literally destroy the microtubules. They blow them up. They literally get destroyed. Now, what I think is then happening is that the destruction of the microtubules in Alzheimer's disease is stopping the brain blocking the information out. So when somebody develops Alzheimer's, they start to see the real reality that's around us, the other parts of the simulation. Like my mother, she started developing something called Charles Bonnet syndrome, which is she was seeing people all around her. She was seeing aliens. She saw an alien grey, for instance, which she described it to the nth degree, a typical Whitley Strieber grey. You know, and I discussed this with Whitley Strieber when I was at Contact in the Desert a few weeks ago. Extraordinary. And again, it's because the doors of perception are breaking down. Then what happens is we can then bypass this when you take substances like dimethyltryptamine and other entheogens. They also stop the brain's ability to act as an attenuator in exactly the same way as Alzheimer's does. And I'm working with a group of people who are doing fascinating research with DMT. They're working with DMT entities. These entities are independent of them. They exist within the greater field, and they come through. So the overall hypothesis works on so many different levels. Now, how can we also open the doors of perception without having any of these neurological issues? Well, I argue that there are certain ways you can do it. I mean, there's a guy called Schieffer, who is a psychiatrist in New York, and he has a pair of welder's glasses. And what they do is they cut out the visual field either side, which effectively puts the dominant hemisphere to sleep. And when you do that, your doors of perception are open because you're actually using your non-dominant hemisphere. Now, again, there's somebody I know, there's something called the WADA test, W-A-D-A, and it was invented by a guy called WADA. And what they do is they inject into the carotid artery sodium amytal, which effectively switches off the dominant hemisphere. And everybody I've interviewed that has had the WADA test done to them say they suddenly find there's somebody else in their head. They suddenly, something else comes up, something else that's different to them comes up from somewhere, and it's the sensation of a much greater mind, and it's the daemon. And this greater mind will speak to them or tell them things, and then when the WADA goes off, they feel it fading away again. It happens with deep hypnotism. A guy called Erickson used to do hypnotism into very deep levels of trance. When he did this, he got to a certain point with somebody, and another entity would come up. Suddenly something else would be in the brain. Now, other people will say he's talking about spirit guides. Yes, I am. Spirit guides that people have, shamanic guides that shamans have, because of course shamans can get into altered states straightforwardly. But there's various methods, and I am working with other people to see how we can try and test this in a more objective scientific way, because people say Anthony Peake's hypotheses are interesting, but he's never proven them within laboratory conditions. Well, I'd argue, first point is, you can't really, because in order to prove cheating the ferryman, you'd have to kill somebody and see what happens in their brain. Okay? Now, 3 or 4 years ago, a German gentleman in his 70s fell off a ladder and he damaged his head. While he was scanning his brain, he had a heart attack and he died. First time that a human brain has been scanned using fMRI scanners. Seconds after he died, areas of the brain started lighting up while he was in the death state, which was interesting. Then there's a lady called Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan in 2017, did a series of experiments where they euthanized rats. Around about 10 seconds after the rat was killed, the brain fired up. And different parts of the brain fired up in this incredible way. So we've got evidence of the near-death experience. Absolute evidence, there's no question. Also, Borjigin has also discovered DMT in the brain of live rats, in the pineal gland of live rats. Now, this can be all linked. In my books, I pull all of this in. I don't just make wild statements and say that, I'm channeling it from the planet Tharg. I don't do that. You know, this is really seriously important stuff. So what we need to do is to start thinking how we can do this. Now, there are people I know that are working at the University of Sussex, which is just down the road from here, and they've been doing fMRI scans of people's brains when they take psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And what they were expecting was the brain, what would happen is the brain would light up everywhere. It would all link up effectively while they were having the hallucinations. Much to their astonishment, but not to mine, they found that areas switched off. In fact, the psilocybin stops your brain's ability to link different parts of the brain. My argument is the reason for that is it's switching off the brain's ability to act as an attenuator. It's reproducing almost the amyloid plaques effect that you have in Alzheimer's. And I'm damn sure I'm right. You know, that we are misunderstanding the evidence we have. Now, I'm only a lay person, you know, but why I'm in the position that I'm almost autistic in my own way, in the sense that I remember virtually everything I read. So I'm in a position that I can remember things and because I'm a massive reader. And also, you know, I'm a graduate sociologist. I've also done, you know, I've studied at postgraduate level, so I know how to study. And indeed, on the back of my work, I've already been offered 3 potential PhD research by the stuff I've had published. So, you know, it's whether I could be bothered doing that. But it could mean I could get the academic qualifications if I really wanted to get them. But that's not what I'm after at the moment. So we're working on this, and it's very, very exciting. And I'm just hoping that a lot of my followers, wrong term, associates, will take my work forward under academic conditions. And I probably won't live to see a lot of this work vindicated and a lot of the ideas I've put forward vindicated. But I believe I will be. And I believe there will be one day where they'll go, you know what? Yeah, he was right. I'd like to believe.
Right. I can't speak as a scientist either, but subjectively, from mystical experiences of my own and people that I've spoken with, what you're saying definitely rings true. I was hoping that you could go into more detail about the DMT experience, and particularly, are there any individuals who have had a near-death experience as well as then previous to the near-death experience or after taken DMT as well and been able to compare that? I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, funnily enough, one of the things that will be in my new book is exactly that. Pascal, the neuroscientist that has written the foreword, interviewed Eben Alexander, who is one of the most famous near-death experiencers. Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon, and he had a severe case of what's the thing? The real problem with his brain. My brain is now gone. I normally can recall these things, but at the moment I can't. But he had a problem with his brain, and he went deeply unconscious, and he was effectively very, very close to death. And he had an amazing near-death experience where he found himself trying to come out of mud. He was climbing out of mud, and then he sees all these weird things in the sky. Then he's on the wings of a huge butterfly, and sitting next to him on the butterfly is this beautiful young woman who had startling blue eyes, specifically colour of blue eyes, and she engages with him and talks to him. And then he finds himself, and various other things happen to him. But suffice to say, he then comes to, and he explains to his parents about seeing this beautiful young girl. And his parents go quiet and said, oh yes, it sounds like your sister. We've never told you, but she died before you were born. So there was evidence of information he brought forward. Now, his experience was extraordinary. What is really interesting is that my associate Pascal found out that subsequent to his experience, he'd taken 5-MeO-DMT. Now, 5-MeO-DMT, just to be technical, is not the same as standard DMT. 5-MeO comes from the body excretions of the Sonoran toad, but it's a similar structure chemically to normal DMT, but it's much more powerful. Friends of mine that have taken both say it's a totally different experience. Whereas with DMT, you see entities, you see machine elves, you go into this really weird world. Whereas when you take 5-MeO, it's like you realise you're everything. You realise that everything is a singular consciousness, and you experience a much, almost inexplicable experience. But Ibn Alexander has done both. And in my new book, I have a précis of the discoveries they made about the similarities between the DMT experience and the near-death experience. And there's a lot more work now being done on this, because the parallels, I think, are significant. Significant enough to say that they are effectively the same experience. As I would argue, ketamine experiences are. Again, there's been a lot of research done on the similarities between ketamine and near-death experiences. So clearly, near-death experiences are neurological. There's no doubt they are created by the brain. But as are hallucinations. But my argument is, well, all you've done is given it a label. Just because the brain creates these things doesn't mean they're not real. Because the brain creates everything we're experiencing now. And this is why scientists, materialist reductionist scientists, annoy the hell out of me. They are perfectly aware of the mysteries of perception. They are perfectly aware of how everything that you are perceiving is literally processed in the visual cortex at the back of their head. They know that. They know that what we think is real isn't. In fact, there's a term used for people who believe there's a one-to-one relationship between what's in here and what's out there. They're called naive realists. That's a scientific term. You believe that what's out there is what you're really saying. You're a naive realist. Because there isn't. There's so much evidence to say that there is something out there, but what it is we don't know, because the brain monitors it and changes it. For example, and it's an argument I've used with a number of scientists, including catching somebody out. At the back of your eye, where the optic nerve leaves, at the back of the retina, there's a spot where there is no light active cells, no cones and rods. That is called the blind spot. Now, with the blind spot, it means that there's a section that you can't see. Now, if you're quite clever, and I sometimes get floaters in my eyes, and I notice this, that a floater will come across and it'll suddenly disappear and reappear again. That's because it's crossed the blind spot. But my question is, where does the blind spot go when you're normal vision? Because you should have a blind spot. Now, I was talking to an ophthalmologist about this, and he said, oh, don't be silly. He said, the reason you don't see the blind spot is we have stereo vision. We have two eyes, and the two images overlap, which cuts out the blind spot. And I said, oh, that's astonishing. So just close one eye now. And he did. And I said, so can you see your blind spot now then? And he said, no. And I said, but you're not using binocular vision now, are you? And he went, I've never thought about that. And I said, yes, so you're taught a load of crap, basically. You're taught to believe things that are not actually true. And what actually happens is the brain fills in the information around the blind spot. It actually fills it in. So you don't see it. But where's it getting that information from? It's extraordinary. And I'll just give one more example for this. And I astonished a few people that contact in the desert on this. You don't see what's out there. You see what your brain wants you to see. And I'll show to your listeners now, and to you if you don't know about this, just how powerful this is. If you go online onto YouTube and you put in gorillas in our midst, M-I-D-S-T, yes. Gorillas in our midst, watch it and follow the instructions on the screen. I did this with a group of people. Basketball, yeah, and you're counting the number of balls. Okay, right. So you know it. So don't ruin it for the listeners. Just count the number of bounces. Mm-hmm. Okay? And I guarantee, I know of one person, unfortunately my wife, who, well, but whatever. But it proves that you anticipate what's out there, and your brain fills in a lot of the reality by your anticipation of what's there.
Right.
So whatever is out there is
astonishing.
It is, isn't it?
That was something we saw in high school. That was a psychology class in high school. We took a look at that.
Well, when I did it with the group,
shows you.
When I did it with the group, they were all sitting there and going, "Oh," and then I said, "Okay, let's do it with somebody else." So there was another member in the group, and I said, "Right, let's get them to do it." And they're all standing around like this, and they're all looking at each other, going. And then he turns around and he said,
right.
17 bounces, and everybody went, "Wow." You know, it's the way
I'll
it
link
is.
that. I'll link that in the.
Okay.
I'll link that in the description of this. I wanted to kind of close things off by talking about a big concept. Once again, you cover a lot of these, but you mentioned at this point, we all realize that time is a subjective experience. If you're closer to a mass, time moves differently. If you're going faster, time moves differently. So how does the concept of time really fit into your theory? Particularly, for me, I got to take the liminal edges of things. So the beginning of time, the end of time, do those concepts even fit into this? Or is time more of a flat circle? How do you view something like the Big Bang, for example?
Right. Well, in terms of the Big Bang, I'm interested in certain factors of the Big Bang. Like, for example, if the Big Bang started from a singularity, and within the Big Bang was also time, that time was also created at that moment, and photons can only travel at the speed of light, how did the Big Bang even get started? Because it didn't have time to start, literally, because it had to start in time. So time would have had to have been created before the Big Bang in order for the Big Bang to happen, if you follow my logic. Now, the other big issue about the Big Bang, which I'll continue with the time theme in a minute, is also if everything that is in existence now, every single quark and electron and the fields they interact within, and of course, when we look at reality, we realize that reality is 99.9999999, etc., empty space. And what is considered to be matter, in fact, are made of 6 quarks and electrons. And that's it, really. So all these quarks and electrons and everything else were all massed together in a point particle that had no extension in space. No extension in space, which means that it covered no space, because there wasn't any space, because also space and time are the same thing. So when the Big Bang happened, not only is my argument about what was the time taking place, but also where was the space coming from, because space itself was created by the Big Bang. But then we have the problem of when all these things, all these little subatomic particles were crammed together into this incredible mass, they must have all been in the same quantum state, which effectively is a specific term I'm using here. So it means that they were in a state of superposition with each other, which is a quantum term. And objects, we know that when they're in a state of superposition, they can communicate instantaneously across time and space. So if you put 2 subatomic particles together, you entangle them and you fire them off in different directions, you do one thing to one, the other one reacts immediately. That's known scientifically. It's been proven since 1981 from the Paris experiment by Dabelard and Alain Aspect. But the argument is that at that point in time, everything was entangled, which means that every single particle in the universe can communicate with every other single particle in the universe instantaneously. Your brain is made up of subatomic particles. Everything else is. So suddenly we're looking at the universe in a very different way. Now, I chatted with Professor Jeff Forshaw, who is considered to be one of the top quantum physicists in the world. He's at the University of Manchester, where they split the atom. He's Brian Cox's PhD tutor. And over coffee he said, of course we now know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. Now, this is extremely important for people out there that take the nonsense that science knows everything and that what we see is real. Just think about this for a second. It means that Everything is entangled. So suddenly, non-location, remote viewing, out-of-the-body experiences, they can all be explained. And they all happen in time. But then we have the issue, as you said, with time, because people don't really get this in terms of Einsteinian physics. Time and space are the same thing. You get more space and less time, or less time and more space. It also means that your feet, the time your feet perceive is slower than your head. Do you remember in Interstellar when they go onto that water planet and they're down there for what, about 20 minutes, but years have gone by? That's a fact. You know, it's something that people don't appreciate. They think time is something that's out there that just is, that's it. It's like a box of time. And it's not. It's not like that at all. You know, time is, it's more reflective. Minkowski, who was Einstein's teacher, came up with a concept called block time. And I've used the argument all the time here that time itself, how do you know time is flowing? We choose the term time flows like a river. But for a second's reflection, you think, hold on a minute. How do I know that time is flowing? I know a river is flowing because I see the riverbanks, which I have a reference point. I see how the river flows past the riverbanks. But we're all in time. Everything is in time. So there's nothing for time to flow against. There's nothing we can measure time by, except if there's another time called time 2, which a guy called J.W. Dunn in the late 1920s suggested, which is time 2, which is the time we measure this time against. And suddenly then your mind starts to get twisted a bit about this. And then you have the concept of orthogonal time, which is a time that runs at right angles from this time flow. In which case, it's an eternal now. This time flow, orthogonal time, is an eternal now. Now, we also know that time's flow is arbitrary. You know, the only reason we think time flows the way it does is because of entropy. It's going from a state of superorder to disorder. But there's no reason why it should flow that way. There's no reason why it can't flow backwards. You know, for example, a photon, which is the boson of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, photon, they say is a photon of light, which is kind of like a light particle, but it's a bit more complex than that. But a photon can only ever travel at the speed of light, and is a point particle. So going back to my point earlier, from the point of view of a photon, there's no time. Because at the speed of light, time stops. And if you can only travel at the speed of light, it means that from a photon's point of view, if it was sentient, everything's the eternal present. The light from a photon leaving a quasar 12 billion years ago to hitting your eye through a telescope, as far as that photon is concerned, is the same instant, which then links you directly to something in the distant past. Which something that's linked you to that means it's simultaneous. So suddenly time disappears in a puff of logic. You know, as St. Augustine said, when I think about time, I think I know what it is, but then I think even deeper and I realise I don't. You know, it's the things that people think deeply about things and they stop, but they don't think deeper. They don't look into, say, hallucinations. What is an hallucination? Why do I see a ghost? How can the chemicals, a drug in my brain, reacting with the chemicals in my brain, create the DMT experience? How? Where's it coming from? Where's all the imagery coming from? Who creates your dreams? You experience a dream. You don't create it. You don't go to bed the night and think, tonight I'm going to dream about England winning the European Championship. The dream happens as if it's been scripted for you. So where's that information coming from? And to just say, oh, it just is. Well, as far as I'm concerned, just is isn't an answer. You know, if we need to really understand what's going on in this universe, we've got to ask the big questions and not dodge them and not pretend because we haven't got answers. There's something called promissory materialism. The idea that there's lots of things science can't explain at the moment, like the binding problem in the brain and various other things. But one day in the future, we'll be able to explain them. Really?
We got to ask those questions. That's what this is about. At least
Absolutely.
we can try to answer those questions. And that's what I'm so pleased that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining me today, Anthony. And you're welcome back anytime. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you. And your ideas are something that I'm going to be sifting through probably for the rest of my life. So
Thank you. Thank you, James. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Oh, hey, you're still here? Well, thanks for watching this far. I really appreciate you doing so. Maybe consider subscribing to the show. Also, leave me a comment in the description below with what you found most interesting about this video, or just make fun of me. That's great too. Either way, if you have a guest that you think would be good for the show, there's a contact in the description of this video. I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.